Beyond the Bony Labyrinths. Podcast on Music and Philosophy by Lodewijk Muns. Episode 19: The Purity of Polyphony. Is music abstract, or does it represent something? That question cannot be answered, not if it is put in that general form. It just depends on which music you are talking about. There is a tradition in the aesthetics of classical music of nevertheless forcing an answer to that question, in the sense that music, proper music, and music in the strict sense of the word, is abstract. In the German-speaking world in particular, this is also referred to as absolute music. The term is said to have been first used by Richard Wagner, but with predominantly negative connotations. Sometimes Wagner used the term for instrumental music, where absolute then means detached, separated from a text that is sung or some other source of motivation. In particular, he used the expression absolute music and absolute melody when referring to opera music, which, in his opinion, consisted exclusively of pleasant tunes without a strong connection to the drama. Wagner later came to a slightly different understanding and denied that there was such a thing as absolute music. Nothing is, in practice, less absolute than music, and the advocates of an absolute music apparently do not know what they are talking about. To embarrass them, one need only ask which music does not derive its form from physical movement or poetry. Thus Wagner in a polemical article in which he defends the symphonic works of Franz Liszt. That view, I think, contains a great deal of truth. The themes of this series are intended as an elaboration of that idea that music is often, or mostly, inextricably linked to language, speech, gesture, movement. In that sense, it cannot be abstract or absolute. That the argument has nevertheless not confounded his opponents is perhaps because it is not, or insufficiently, supported by analysis, but also because the doctrine that Wagner rejects has a metaphysical character. It assumes an essence of music. It is less about music as it sounds and as it is experienced, what Wagner calls its appearance in life, than about something it is supposed to be apart from that sound and experience, if that is even possible. Polemics for and against so-called absolute music have dragged on for 2 centuries, with a high degree of confusion about what exactly it entails. In recent decades, though, enthusiasm for the absolute view has waned considerably. There is a growing interest and increasing understanding of what happens in our minds and brains when we engage with music. The focus is then less on the essence of music and more on the coherence of our experience, the cognitive and emotional processes that are involved. But the predicate absolute, or rather abstract, may well apply to some music. Abstract in the sense that it does not represent or express anything. One could speak of a doctrine of absolute music that rests on two dogmas, assumptions that are considered more or less obvious. Dogma number 1 states, only instrumental music is proper, pure music. And dogma number 2 states, pure music is abstract. It represents and expresses nothing. As for dogma 1, that proper, pure music can only be instrumental music, that implies that vocal music is music plus additives, specifically lyrics. But if so, then one must conclude that a vast majority of the world's music is not proper music. Even in the classical tradition, vocal genres were often dominant: cantata, opera, oratorio, song. You might say, so what? Even if that is not proper music, that says nothing about the value or quality of that music. Then again, it is wrong that just because there is no text, instrumental music would be free of elements derived from or conditioned by poetry and dance. Instrumental music usually owes much of its meaning to associations with movement, vocal expression, and language-like syntax. The most influential formulation of a doctrine of absolute music is the famous, notorious Vom musikalisch Schönen, on musical beauty, of 1854 by the Viennese music critic Eduard Hanslick. The term absolute music appears in Hanslick's formulation of what I've called dogma number 1. Of what instrumental music cannot do, it ought never be said that music can do it, because only instrumental music is pure and absolute music. To this he adds his somewhat obscure version of dogma number 2. The content of music and what it represents is nothing but patterns animated in sound. The original German, tönend bewegte Formen, is almost untranslatable. Because of these propositions, Hanslick has often been cited as the patriarch of formalism in music aesthetics, the idea that music can at most vaguely represent or express something, but is primarily a sonic play of forms. He himself rejected that interpretation, and you can find all sorts of remarks in his little book that restrict his formalist position. One problem is that he expounded his views mainly in opposition to an aesthetics of emotions that he passionately disliked, the view that music is primarily about expressing and arousing feelings. To clarify his view of music as animated forms, Hanslick points to the kaleidoscope. Music is such a kaleidoscope, but on an immeasurably higher plane. It produces beautiful forms and colors in ever-evolving variety, with smooth transitions, sharp contrasts, always symmetrical and fulfilled in itself. This higher plane implies that music, much more than a kaleidoscope, is a manifestation of the human creative mind. But at this point his argument remains vague. In this age of electronic toys, you can also think of visualizations like those of Windows Media Player. This accompanies music according to an algorithm through kaleidoscopic, moving images with smooth transitions and sharp contrasts. I think Hanslick's view does not do justice to the nature of most music, and certainly not the music he wrote about. But if, within the tradition of classical music, you would want to identify music that could be labeled as abstract formal play, a music in which poetic, rhetorical, and visual components play little or no role, then the choice is fairly obvious. In a footnote, Hanslick approvingly quotes the then highly regarded philosopher Johann Friedrich Herbart. To this day, even music experts repeat the statement that music expresses feelings, as if the feeling that it might arouse is based on the general rules of simple and double counterpoint that constitute its true essence. What might the old masters who elaborated the possible forms of the fugue have wanted to express? They did not want to express anything at all. Their thinking was directed not to go beyond the essence of the art, but right into the heart of it. According to Herbart, The true essence of music lies in the rules of counterpoint, and he cites fugue as a contrapuntal form. I doubt that Herbert has made a serious attempt to think through his cross assertion. But if indeed we want to see music as an abstract play of forms, in which elements of feeling can be irrelevant, then we find the most plausible examples in polyphony and counterpoint. Counterpoint is a set of rules according to which several voices can sound simultaneously, the phenomenon we call polyphony. Polyphony is of vocal origin, as is suggested by the German word Mehrstimmigkeit, but it can also be realized with instruments, even on a keyboard instrument, although then any timbral contrast between voices is missing. The most exemplary realization can be found in canon and fugue, in which the individual voices follow the same melody at different times and pitch. I played this three-part Invention by Bach in its entirety earlier. It could be characterized as a brilliant play with an, in itself not particularly significant, scalar figure. If you're looking for words to characterize this piece, then energetic might apply. But I don't think the piece expresses or represents a feeling of cheerfulness. It is, however, as formal play, in Hanslick's terms, a manifestation of the human creative spirit. One could also say of recognizably human intelligence, as opposed to mechanical manipulation or algorithmic calculation. At the height of his revolutionary phase, Richard Wagner is no worshipper of counterpoint. In Das Kunstwerk der Zukunft, the artwork of the future from 1849, he speaks of counterpoint as a model of absolute music, and as such a sterile and mechanical phenomenon. Counterpoint, in all its manifold offspring, is art playing with itself artificially. It is the mathematics of feeling, the mechanical rhythm of egoistic harmony. In its invention, the abstract art of music pleased itself so much that it pretended to be nothing but an absolute art that exists for its own sake, as an art that owes its existence not to any human need, but purely to itself, to its absolute divine essence. Wagner wrote this at a time when he was being persecuted as a political revolutionary, also a phase in his career when composing was at a low point. Obsessed with analogies, he saw a parallel between absolute music and the absolute state, a state that is oppressive because it is not grounded in human needs. Wagner describes counterpoint as mechanical, and I think the rules could in principle be formulated as an algorithm, as a formula that can be applied mechanically. That might not even require artificial intelligence, but it is striking how little progress has been made in this direction. A few years ago, Google released a doodle to celebrate Bach's birthday, a little program trained with AI to harmonize short melodies following the model of Bach's chorale harmonisations. It is still online. Its results are dismal. This simple little melody could be harmonized as follows. But this is an example of what Google makes of it. A chorale harmonization consists of a series of chords that we experience as a coherent sequence. But counterpoint also plays a role in such a harmonization. There is a fixed number of parts or voices, usually 4, and the progression is constrained by the rules of counterpoint. The Bach doodle is trained to imitate patterns that occur in Bach's chorale settings, but it seems unable to derive general rules from those patterns. It's a bit like putting words together with no sense of meaning and no knowledge of grammar. Several voices sounding together produce chords, and the structure and sequence of those chords is neither random nor entirely determined by the individual voices. As I discussed in episode 4, harmony is a kind of syntax that gives a musical phrase a direction and ensures a correct ending. This is one of the things that go wrong with the Google Doodle. It is still a point of contention in music theory, a rather nonsensical point of contention. Is harmony a product of individual voices, or are the voices derived from a sequence of chords? Which is primary, harmony or counterpoint? Harmony and counterpoint interact in classical music. They overlap. You cannot apply one without the other. There is complementarity, not polarity. However, greater weight can be given to one over the other. Historically, there is a trend towards a stronger role for harmony without strict polyphony. You cannot say of a piano piece of an orchestra work that it has 3, 4, or 30 parts. We find a perfect balance and synthesis of harmony and counterpoint in Bach. The voices individually have an interesting shape, but at the same time there is a constant suspense due to the direction the harmony takes. In this Prelude in F major from Bach's wohltemperierte Klavier Part 2, voices seem to emerge from chords, only to be assimilated by a chord again. It is like a demonstration of the complementarity of harmony and counterpoint, but with a certain freedom in polyphony. New voices can break free from a chord and merge into the next chord. You can therefore hear the prelude as a series of ornamented chords or as a continuous interplay of lines from which chords emerge. I will play the prelude and its fugue in full at the end of this episode. Particularly with Bach, you can also see how the balance can lean to one side or the other. Thematic material that lends itself to the most complex contrapuntal applications tends to have a more neutral character, with less harmonic suspense. The same is true of the art of fugue, the Kunst der Fuge, Bach's last and just unfinished work. It is one of his most abstract compositions. The theme itself does not sound particularly interesting. And in its inversion it sounds like this. Albert Schweitzer, the musician, physician, theologian, wrote in his book on Bach of 1905 the following. The theme cannot strictly be called interesting. It is not a stroke of genius, but has plainly been made with an eye to its manifold workableness and capacity for inversion. That is a matter-of-fact observation. But with his romantic inclinations, Schweitzer cannot leave it at that, to leave abstraction abstract. He seeks a more poetic approach and finds a way to turn precisely the negative quality, the lack of expression, into imagery. Nevertheless, it grows upon us after repeated hearings. It introduces us to a still and serious world, deserted and rigid, without color, without light, without motion. It does not gladden, does not distract, yet we cannot break away from it. Involuntarily, presumably, these words echo what his older colleague Philipp Spitta wrote 25 years earlier. Spitta speaks of the profound seriousness of the mood, a life more deeply withdrawn, that overcomes the listener, particularly in the first fugues, like the solemn calm of a winter's night. Even the theme, which has been wrongly labeled merely musically useful but in itself insignificant, is imbued with this mood. A silent, rigid world, a calm winter night, is what Schweitzer and Spita associate with this music. It is the absence of something one might expect from music, something like warm feelings. You can argue about to what extent this fugue, the first of the Kunst der Fuge, has expressive qualities, but it is clearly more an abstract play of forms than the fugues in the wohltemperierte Klavier. The title, Kunst der Fuge, it is not certain that it was given by Bach himself, but it is hard to imagine a better one, even if it sounds more like the title of a treatise. Or precisely for that reason. The title suggests that the work is about the fugue, where in fact it is a series of fugues and canons. But as fugues have a modal function, the work as a whole should show how to exploit and exhaust the contrapuntal possibilities of a theme. One might therefore think that this is a case of meta-music, as I discussed in episode 5. It may not be music that represents polyphony or counterpoint, but it is music that exemplifies the possibilities of counterpoint, music that draws attention to its own ingenious construction. This also applies to the short 2- and 3-part inventions, one of which I played. Bach intended these as material for learning how to play polyphony with a singing quality, eine kantable Art im Spielen, but also as a model for composing. They show how to spin out a motif into a fluent polyphonic piece. The art of fugue marks a moment when strictly polyphonic music and contrapuntal artifice have gone out of fashion. The art of counterpoint is not falling into disuse, but has a more limited application, and with the connotation that it is actually something from the past and that can also recall that past. This was a 2-part invention, composed around 1900, that evokes the model of Bach's inventions. The composer is Heinrich Schenker, an Austrian music theorist. Between 1900 and 1935, he developed a theory that is the most rigorous elaboration of the idea that the essence of music lies in the purity of polyphony. Schenker's theory is still controversial and has great influence, especially in the United States. The core of that theory is that all music, at least music in the classical tradition, can be reduced to an underlying structure that is essentially contrapuntal. In other words, the voicing rules that typically govern note-to-note relationships, these Schenker wants to apply to a larger context, beyond musical phrases, from the first note to the last. Actually, Schenker's theory is a rigorous elaboration precisely of Halbert's thesis that was quoted by Hanslick, the thesis that the essence of music lies in the rules of counterpoint. The more or less complex surface of music, the foreground, conceals, according to Schenker, an extremely simple contrapuntal background. Now, all music theory assumes a distinction between the structure of a composition, its larger coherence, and the notes or sound patterns that we perceive from moment to moment. All music has a form that can be described analytically. But what determines structure in the music of the 18th and 19th centuries are mainly harmonic principles and recurring melodic themes and motifs. In the supposed polarity of harmony and counterpoint, Schenker opts for counterpoint, against the mainstream of theory and against common compositional practice. The contrapuntal core of the composition, a kind of musical skeleton, Schenker calls Ursatz, literally primal phrase or primal counterpoint. This Ursatz consists of 6 notes, a descending line with pendulating bass. How do you get from that simple motif to a complex composition? according to Schenker by inserting notes in between and then repeating the process in variable but regulated ways. Each subsequent level can be traced back to the previous one according to the rules of counterpoint. It is a strictly recursive structure, like the branches of a plant. In his view, the whole structure, with its different levels, is a kind of unfolding or emanation of that primal sound pattern by something like an organic force or will that inhabits the tones. The analytical understanding of that contrapuntal structure thus takes on the character of a revelation of the divine, of God. All that is organic, all coherence belongs to God and remains His gift even in those human creations which are perceived as organic. The totality of the foreground, which men call chaos, God derives from the background that is His cosmos. The infinite harmony of His infinite being resides in this coherence. So says Schenker in his last book. Now compare that with the passage I quoted earlier from Wagner. Counterpoint, in all its manifold offspring, is art playing with itself artificially. It is the mathematics of feeling, the mechanical rhythm of egoistic harmony. In its invention, the abstract art of music pleased itself so much that it pretended to be nothing but an absolute art that exists for its own sake, as an art that owed its existence not to any human need, but purely to itself, to its absolute divine essence. There is much that both quotes have in common, but with a radically opposite appreciation. For Wagner, too, at this stage of his thinking, counterpoint is what keeps music going. Both speak of a divine origin, but what for Wagner is a false pretense of absolute music is for Schenker the ultimate truth. What Wagner calls mechanical is for Schenker an organic force. Schenker's theory is less a theory than a dogmatic system with religious overtones. He saw himself as a musical Moses to whom God's truth had been revealed. It was conceived in a context with not only religious but also German chauvinist and racist components. And it is not just a historical curiosity. In part of the world, especially in the United States, it is still taken seriously. It even has a dominant position in education. That this could have happened is an astonishing fact that, to my knowledge, has not yet been adequately explained. Part of the explanation lies in the view that a theory can be detached from its ideological context, that its inner coherence remains intact if you filter out Schenker's exclamatory propaganda. The question remains how it is possible for that theory to be considered coherent or illuminating. This is a tricky question. What plays a role is the fact that Schenker's theory belongs to a category of thought systems that, for some at least, exert a certain fascination. These are systems that attempt to explain an infinite multiplicity through the application of a single, simple principle. To these belong the philosophy of Hegel, which influenced Schenker, and the linguistics of Chomsky, with whom Schenker has been compared. The origins of that way of thinking lie with Plato and later Neoplatonism. Platonic doctrine tries to explain the world of phenomena as they appear to us as a kind of emanation or objectification of ideas, the most abstract categories to which we can reduce them. Linked to this is the idea that the abstract is higher, purer than physical phenomena. The inspiration for this lies in mathematics, the most abstract, meaningful system that mankind has devised or discovered. Its meaning, its reality is evident from its applicability, from the simplest counting or measurement to the complex laws of natural science. But the art of counterpoint is not natural science. It has no laws but changeable rules, and the scope of its applicability is limited. In conclusion, I return to Bach. Earlier on I played part of the Prelude in F major from the second book of the wohltemperierte Klavier. I will now play it in its entirety. In the fugue that follows, the three voices are at each other's heels. It is one of the most playful and dance-like fugues of all. The character of the movement is something you can feel in your body. In this sense, the fugue is not abstract. This was episode 19 of Beyond the Bony Labyrinths.